So we're going to introduce some other types of inheritance patterns today that don't explicitly follow Mendel's rules for heredity. So in other words, it's not going to be a dominant and recessive rule. It's a little bit something, it's different. I don't want to use the word complex, I suppose, just different rules is what we'll be looking at. So just to clear things up, and to kind of remove some misconceptions. Most traits do not follow those Mendelian rules that we've been working with. Most traits are not dominant and recessive. Things like unattached and attached earlobes, your eye color, your ability to roll your tongue, these are actually controlled by several genes, not just one allele pair. So we start genetics by learning about Mendelian rules because it's simple. It's a nice, easy model to understand, and the traits that we have listed here are very visual and easy to process and easy to think about, but they're actually a little bit more complicated than that. Typically, things that follow Mendelian rules tend to be disorders, things like color blindness, cystic fibrosis, hemophilia, Huntington disease, Marfan syndrome, and Tay-Sachs. These are some types of diseases or disorders that do strictly follow Mendelian rules. But a lot of the stuff that makes up your overall phenotype can be a little more complicated than that. So these are them. These are the 6 other types of complex heredity, the 6 other rules that you would follow when you're thinking about allele combinations. Incomplete dominance, codominance, sex-linked traits, polygenic inheritance, multifactorial inheritance, and then pleiotropy. The ones with stars next to them, those are the ones that you'll be responsible for in class. These other 3 are actually, let's put those into a category called complex heredity because those can be quite complicated. These are just different rules. You'll pick up on them, no problem, but these are where things get tricky. You'll probably address these in a high school bio. All right, so let's start with incomplete dominance. This is a type of inheritance patterns where the phenotype of the heterozygous genotype, so uppercase, lowercase, or the blend of the 2 alleles, it's a blend of the homozygous parents. So it's a pretty tricky sentence right there. Take some time to read that through and process it. But essentially what it means is that the 2 alleles will blend together if the genotype is heterozygous. So here we have a homozygous genotype, big R, big R. Here we have another homozygous genotype, big W, but if you blend them together, you get the heterozygous one, which is one of each, and that phenotype is going to be a blend of the parents. So it won't be red, it won't be pink, it won't be red or white, it'll be pink. Both alleles are equally dominant, so they're both expressed, which is also why we're using 2 different letters. So with Mendelian rules, we use an uppercase and a lowercase to show the difference, but with incomplete dominance, since both alleles have a dominant trait to them, they both get their own letter. So let's take a look. So if you were to have a parent generation where you have the homozygous red and the homozygous white and you crossbreed those, the next generation will be 100% pink. But if you crossbreed those, you have heterozygous and heterozygous, what will end up happening is you'll get that red returning, you'll get that white returning, and then 50% will be pink still. So that's kind of, there's some similar patterns that you might pick up with to the Mendelian rules, but the colors, the phenotypes are going to be a little bit different. Instead of having just 2 phenotypes, we actually have 3 now. Nose shape is an example of incomplete dominance. The shape of your nose is a blend of the alleles that you got from your parents. Codominance. Codominance is when both alleles are visible in the phenotype of a heterozygous offspring. It's very, very similar to incomplete dominance, but instead of being a blend of colors, both are actually expressed individually of each other. So a red flower and a white flower, instead of making a pink flower, it will make a red and white flower. So this is a heterozygous genotype for between a red and a white flower. Horses, this Appaloosa horse is a good example of this. So here you have a dark horse with an Appaloosa horse, and then the offspring will be a blend. It'll be a co-dominant version of those horses. So there's spotting that's going on right there. Here's a chocolate milk cow, does the same thing. This lobster is really cool. It's not exactly codominance, unfortunately. It's a little more complicated. It's called chimerism, but it kind of illustrates the point of what we'd be trying to get across. Same thing with this tortoise-shell cat. I think it's a really cool picture, but unfortunately the genetics are slightly more complicated than codominance. It's just a cool picture. Also, take a look at the eyes. That's called heterochromia, 2 different colored eyes. Pretty neat. Blood type. So blood type is really interesting because it's mostly codominant, but there is actually a little Mendelian going on as well. So there's some codominant alleles, but also recessive allele. So your blood type, for any human blood type, there are three main alleles: an A allele, a B allele, and an O allele. The A and the B alleles behave codominantly, while the O allele is recessive. So, for example, if your mother was AB and your father was AB, if the alleles that you happen to get from your father were A from your father and B from your mother, you would codominantly have both A and B alleles for your blood type. So your blood type would be AB. But if your mother was O, if you got an O allele from your mother and the A allele from your father, then you would just be type A, because the O behaves recessively and it doesn't do much to change anything about your blood type. So it would just be type A. A and B are codominant, O is recessive. So here's a good summary of how that means. A and A would be type A allele and O allele would be type A and B, that's your codominant heterozygous allele combination, that's going to be type AB. B and B would be type B, B and the recessive O is type B, and then O and O is just going to be straight up recessive O. Sex-linked traits isn't really an inheritance pattern, it's more about alleles, we've kind of gone over this before, it's more about alleles that exist on a chromosome that also determines your gender. So here we have a bunch of stripes, each one of these stripes represents a different gene, and it could be anything. Some of these are going to be gender related genes, like the development of testes or ovaries or whatever, but some of them might have nothing to do with gender, like baldness or hairy ears or something like that. So just because those alleles occur on the same chromosome that determines gender, we call it a sex-linked trait. You include, when you're writing sex-linked traits, you kind of, instead of writing a big H and a little h as your alleles, you use the H's as superscripts above the chromosome. So you're also keeping track of the chromosome in addition to the allele. The Y chromosome is shorter than the X chromosome, and males are XY and females are XX. This missing section is pretty pivotal because it means that for males, you'll only get one allele for a specific trait, whereas if you were a female, you'd have a full X chromosome here, and you'd have two copies of alleles, or two copies for that gene. So as such, males only get one shot at inheriting a good allele for whatever traits these happen to be. So here's a good example of this. Here's a female. She's going to be XX, two X chromosomes, and the male's XY. We'll say this red X is the good version of whatever trait happens to be on that X chromosome, and this blue X chromosome happens to contain a bad gene, or I'm sorry, a bad allele. So in this case, the four possible combinations of these chromosomes is you could get an X from mom and a Y from dad. This would be a normal male. You could have this good X from mom and this good X from dad. That'd be a normal female, XX. You could get this bad X from mom and this good Y from dad. That would be an affected male because he doesn't have a second copy for whatever allele that is. And then you could also have a good X from dad and a bad X from mom. That would be a carrier female. So she wouldn't be affected by the disease because she happens to have a good X that she got from her dad, but she would be carrying disease to possibly pass on to her future children. So as a silly example, let's say that there's a gene that influences your body odor, which is located on the X chromosome. The dominant version of this allele, which we'll say is capital T, gives you normal BO, or normal body odor, while the recessive version makes you smell like rotten feces. All right, so here is a regular male. This is normal BO, and here's a carrier female. She smells fine, but she does carry the bad allele. So this person would be X big T, X big T. Remember, the allele is a superscript, and the chromosome is also stated as a letter right there. Here would be a normal male. Here would be another carrier female, but she'd be fine. And here would be an affected male. So this male gets a good Y chromosome and a bad X chromosome. But because the Y chromosome is shorter than the X chromosome, it's not going to carry a second backup allele for wherever this allele is located on the X chromosome. So now let's take this carrier female and cross it with a smelly male. So here we would have a carrier female. She would smell normal, but she would carry the allele. Here we have a normal male. Here we have a smelly female because she has a bad copy from dad and a bad copy from mom. And then here's a smelly male. So in order for a female to inherit it, they have to get two defective alleles, whereas a male only needs to get one affected allele because he doesn't have that second backup copy. There are some sex chromosome disorders that are kind of interesting. If you happen to inherit a third X, So you get 3X chromosomes. It's not that big of a deal. It's called trisomy X. You would be a female. You might be taller than average, but you would have normal fertility, meaning you can give birth and have a family. If you happen to get an extra Y chromosome, that too is no big deal. Your gender would be a male. You'd have a normal phenotype, but you might have a high growth velocity. If you have this genotype, most people don't even know that it exists. There's not much difference between this and a regular XY genotype. If you happen to just get one X chromosome and you didn't get the second one, you would be female, but you would have a short webbed neck. Your ears would be kind of lower on your head, and you may not develop a menstrual cycle, which would mean that you'd be unable to have children. If you got a second X, so XXY, this isn't great either. This is called Klinefelter syndrome. You would be male, but you'd also generally be sterile, meaning you couldn't have kids. You'd have weaker muscles, you'd be tall, you'd have poor coordination, you're just kind of a gangly person. All right, so our fourth type of genetic inheritance is called polygenic inheritance. This is when many genes influence one trait. Most traits are polygenic, so the vast majority of your 36,000 traits or however many you have, they usually follow this polygenic inheritance. So height is a really good example. So notice the combination of 3 genes that follow a curved distribution. So we have 3 genes here, the A gene, the B gene, and the C gene. If they're each heterozygous, so if an individual is heterozygous for these 3 genes, and then they cross with someone else who's heterozygous, then you would get this really interesting distribution of how of the likelihood of inheriting a specific type. So in this case, you're less likely to get all dominant alleles, and you're also less likely to get very short alleles. You'd probably end up in the middle, which is where most people would be. This is why the majority of people are of average height, obviously, and a very few of you get the very tall alleles, and a very few of you get the very short alleles. Eye color is also polygenic. We've been talking about eye color as if it follows Mendelian rules, but it doesn't really. It's a little more complicated than that. There exists many shades of blue and brown, and this is the result of different combinations of dominant and recessive alleles. Multifactorial inheritance refers to polygenic traits that are also influenced by the environment. So this should sound familiar to you, especially if you look at this picture here, where you have a little bit of DNA that's unwrapped around this histone protein. So this concept is very, very similar, if not identical, to epigenetics. So things like height, weight, schizophrenia, cancer, diabetes, while you may be predisposed to some of these traits due to the genetics that you inherited, how you interact with your environment will also determine whether or not you're tall. If you eat right, you'll probably have you'll get the maximum amount of your height alleles. If you don't eat right, that will impact your weight. Diabetes and cancer. If you're always smoking, that will increase your chances of developing lung cancer. So in this case, your phenotype is a combination of the genetics that you inherited, but also the environment in which you are spending a lot of your time. Skin color is kind of an example of polygenetic inheritance, because while you do have a baseline skin color, you can impact it by the environment in which you are that you go into. What I mean by that is how much UV light you get exposed to. So you have a baseline skin color, but if you get exposed to a lot of UV light, then you're going to mutate your DNA ever so subtly for a moment, and at least epigenetically, and that's going to tell your skin to produce more melanin, which will make your skin darker. Then through mitosis, those cells will die and go away, and your skin will slowly fade back to its baseline color. So for example, the sun comes in and it damages the upper layer of your skin, damages the DNA there. DNA repair induces melanocytes. This produces a pigment called melanin. The burn requires a lot of repair, so extra blood is sent to provide resources, and this makes your skin initially look very red, which is why you look red right after you get a sunburn for the first 24 hours. When you push on that red skin, it kind of goes away and looks white for a little bit, because you're literally pushing the blood away out of the capillaries, and then it floods back into place as soon as you lift your finger up. The tan fades as mitosis replaces the skin cells that have extra melanin with normal skin pigmented cells. One kind of interesting thing about skin color, not that this has to do with genetics, but it's more like a cultural thing, is that pale skin during the Renaissance was viewed as higher class because it meant that you didn't have to work outdoors and you were protected from the sun. So that's why you'd see these aristocrats with very white and pale faces. They'd even go as far as to powder their faces to make them look very, very pale. That kind of flipped on its head, interestingly enough, during the Industrial Revolution, because then the workplace transitioned inside, where people were working in factories, and that was typically the lower class. And then they tended to have pale skin, whereas spending time outdoors on vacation meant that you had enough money to travel, take resources, and go to nice, warm, sunny beaches, and you would get a tan. So kind of, it's interesting how that phenotype completely 180 on the general population. Okay, our last major method of genetic inheritance is called pleiotropy. This is when one gene influences many traits. It's kind of the opposite of polygenetic. So the mechanism for a pleiotropic gene is that it will produce something that is used by many cells. For example, the gene for white fur also controls eye color, which is why this Siberian looking tiger has blue eyes. It's kind of like this one gene that gets created is going to be used for this trait, and this trait. And that's pleiotropy. Okay, thanks for watching. That's the T, and I guess for the rest of class I have something that you guys can work on to kind of practice these couple of different methods of inheriting traits.